Soldier Boy showed up in season 3 of The Boys, and most people had a reaction to him. He was funny. He was brutal. He was Jensen Ackles being impossibly watchable in a patriotic costume, while saying things that made you laugh and then immediately feel bad about laughing. That was the surface read, and it was enough for a lot of people. But underneath that surface is one of the most carefully constructed psychological portraits in the show's entire run. A man born in 1919 who is still, in 2022, being controlled by something his father said to him before World War II even ended. A man whose body literally explodes when his emotions get too large to hold. A man who had a son he never knew about, found him, and then said to that son the exact words his own father used to destroy him. Welcome to Between the Episodes. Let's get started. Section 1. The Boy Behind the Shield. Soldier Boy's childhood and the father who broke him. Benjamin was born in 1919 into money. Not the kind of money that gets mentioned casually. The kind that means your father owns half the steel mills in the state. The kind that means you grow up in a house with staff, with distance, with the particular coldness that comes from having everything material and nothing emotional. The official Vought story about Soldier Boy's origins said he was a poor kid from South Philadelphia who pulled himself up through hard work and bravery. That story was a lie, and the show tells you so directly. Ben came from privilege. What he did not come from was warmth. His father was verbally abusive and emotionally neglectful. The show makes one detail about this very specific. His father never hit him. Not because he was restrained or kind, but because he considered Ben such a complete failure that he didn't think Ben was worth the physical effort. That is a particular kind of cruelty. A bruise heals. A scar can be pointed to. The message that you are so worthless that hurting you would be a waste of someone's energy. That one has nowhere to go. It just sits there, quiet and permanent, shaping everything that comes after it. Ben was sent to boarding school young, not to grow, not to learn, not to be made into something better. The show is clear about his father's motivation. He sent Ben away to get rid of him. The house became quieter. The problem was removed. And a boy who had already started to understand that he was unwanted got the message delivered in the most complete way possible. He was not just ignored inside the home. He was removed from it entirely. To cope with what was happening at home, before the boarding school years, Ben started sneaking sips of his father's Manhattan cocktails. He was a child doing this, not a teenager experimenting. A child. Stealing alcohol to make the feeling of being invisible in his own house slightly more bearable. That detail matters more than it might seem. The substance use that would follow him through his entire life, the cocaine in his celebrity years, the marijuana the boys would eventually use to manage his PTSD, starts here, in a wealthy house in South Philadelphia, with a kid who had no other tool available for pain. The thing Ben wanted more than anything was simple. He wanted his father to be proud of him. That desire is not complicated or interesting on its own. Every child wants parental approval. What makes Ben's version of it specific is what he did with it, and what it cost him. Because Ben decided that if the ordinary version of himself was not worth his father's attention, he would become something impossible to ignore. He would not just be successful. He would be the most celebrated, most powerful, most famous person in the world. He would make himself so undeniably great that his father would have no choice but to acknowledge it. So he used his father's connections with the military to get himself enrolled in the Compound V trials run by Frederick Vought. This was the program that would eventually produce Homelander, the most powerful being on the planet. Ben went in as a wealthy, neglected young man, desperate to prove something. He came out as Soldier Boy, the strongest man alive, a genuine superhero, America's first. He fought in World War II. He came home a hero. Crowds celebrated him. The country loved him. His father told him he had cheated. Those were essentially the words. A real man would not have taken a shortcut. A real man would not have needed compound V to become strong. The thing Ben had engineered his entire identity around, the transformation that was supposed to make him undeniable, was dismissed in a sentence. You didn't earn this. You cheated. The goalposts did not just move, they disappeared. That moment is the psychological engine of everything Soldier Boy does for the rest of his life. Not the Russia captivity, not the betrayal at Nicaragua, not the 40 years of torture. Those things matter enormously, and this essay will spend a great deal of time on them. But the root, the place where the damage starts, is a father in a wealthy house telling his son, after everything, that he still was not enough. What Ben does with that wound is exactly what psychology would predict, and what the show traces with real precision across his entire arc. He does not grieve it. He does not process it. He converts it entirely into fuel. He becomes obsessed with being seen, with being celebrated, with maintaining his position as the top of every room he enters. He becomes the leader of Payback, Vaught's premier superhero team. He becomes a movie star in the 1950s. He spends the 1970s at the Playboy Mansion. He collects women, attention, adoration, headlines. Every piece of external validation is a brick going into a wall that is supposed to keep the original message out. You are not enough. You are not worth the effort. You are a disappointment. The bricks never stack high enough. Because the thing about building your entire sense of worth out of external approval is that it requires constant maintenance. The moment the applause stops, the original wound reopens. Ben cannot tolerate being outshone, because being outshone means someone else is getting the attention that he needs to survive. He cannot tolerate being questioned, because being questioned threatens the image that he has built to replace the self he could never get his father to value. He cannot tolerate weakness, not in himself, not in anyone around him, because weakness is what got him sent away. This is the psychology the show is actually tracking, even when it looks like it is just tracking a very loud and very aggressive superhero throwing his weight around. Every act of dominance Ben performs across Payback is an act of self-preservation. Every teammate he belittles, every woman he dismisses, every younger hero he abuses, all of it is the behavior of a person who learned early that the world will remove you if you are not strong enough, impressive enough, valuable enough. He is not cruel for the sake of cruelty. He is terrified. And cruelty is the only language he was ever taught for fear. Jensen Ackles, who played the character, said this directly. In his own words, he was taught to stand up, dust it off, and be a man about it. His father was taught the same thing by his grandfather, who served in the Second World War. Ackles described himself as possibly one of the last generations to witness that kind of toxic masculinity without any social pushback. And he used that personal experience to play Ben. The character is not distant. He is a specific, recognizable product of a specific, real set of instructions about what men are allowed to feel and show. Eric Kripke, the showrunner, was equally specific in his Variety interview about what Soldier Boy was meant to represent in Season 3. He said the writers had a character who could take an audience through every decade of the 20th century and show them what men were actually like. Not the myth of the greatest generation, but the reality. The reality, Kripke said, was that these ideas about what makes a real man were being passed down from fathers to sons, generation after generation. And the show wanted to trace exactly how that worked and what it cost. That is the frame. That is what Ben's childhood is actually doing in the story. The Vought propaganda version of Soldier Boy's origin is a poor boy made good through bravery and hard work. The real version is a rich boy who was made to feel worthless by the one person whose approval he wanted, and who spent the next century trying to outrun that feeling through power, fame, and the complete suppression of anything that might make him look weak. The propaganda version is clean and simple and good for business. The real version is what happens when a wound that size never gets treated. Ben did not become Soldier Boy because he was brave. He became Soldier Boy because he was desperate. And the show is careful to hold both of those things at the same time. He is not just a villain who happened to have a bad father. He is a human being whose entire psychology was shaped by a rejection he never recovered from, who went on to build himself into something so large and so loud that nobody would ever be able to look at him the way his father did. The tragedy is that it worked publicly and failed completely privately. The whole world celebrated Soldier Boy. The one audience he was performing for never showed up. One more detail before moving forward, because it becomes important later in ways the show makes explicit. The fact that Ben's father never physically struck him is not a mitigating detail. It is a clarifying one. Physical abuse leaves evidence. It creates a clear before and after. What Ben's father did was quieter and harder to name. It was the slow accumulation of being treated as someone not worth the effort, not worth the space, not worth the pain of even attempting to correct. That kind of damage does not announce itself. It just shapes everything quietly, from the inside, until the person it shaped cannot remember what it felt like not to carry it. Ben carried it across 2 world wars, 4 decades of captivity, the destruction of every relationship he ever had, and eventually into a confrontation with a son he had never known existed, where he would open his mouth and, without seeming to realize it, say exactly what his father said to him. That reproduction is not an accident. The show builds toward it deliberately. But to understand what happens when Soldier Boy finally meets Homelander, and why the words he chooses are the ones he chooses, the story of what happened between 1919 and 1984 has to be understood first. The wound that gets passed down does not start with Ben. Ben is just the generation the show decides to follow. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What happens next is where Ben's story stops being about his father and starts being about what the world made of the thing his father created. Because Vought did not just give Ben power. Vought gave Ben an audience, a costume, a myth, and 40 years of practice performing a version of strength that had nothing to do with anything real. Understanding what that performance cost him, and who it eventually destroyed, requires going inside the one institution that shaped him just as thoroughly as his father did. Section 2. The Vought Machine. How a corporation weaponized a broken man. Vought International did not discover Benjamin. They built him. That distinction matters more than it might seem at first. Benjamin did not walk into Vaught's doors as a finished product that the company then marketed to the world. He walked in as a wealthy, emotionally hollowed-out young man who needed something from the world and had no healthy way of getting it. Vought looked at that need and saw an opportunity. They gave him a name, a costume, a story, and a stage. They told the country he was born poor. They told the country he was brave. They told the country he fought for liberty and justice and the American way. Every single one of those things was a corporate decision, not a fact. The official Vought backstory for Soldier Boy said he came from nothing. Poor family, South Philadelphia. Pulled himself up through grit and hard work and natural courage. The story was engineered for maximum appeal. A rich kid from a steel dynasty who used his father's military connections to get injected with experimental chemicals is not a great recruitment poster. A scrappy underdog who earned his power through sheer American determination is. Vought chose the version that sold and buried the version that was true. This is the first thing Vought does to Ben. They replace his actual story with a better one. And Ben goes along with it. Of course he does. The real story involves a father who shipped him away and told him he cheated. The Vought story involves a hero who earned everything through valor. Given those two options, it is not hard to understand why Ben embraced the fabricated version so completely that he eventually seems to believe it himself. The propaganda does not just change what the public thinks about him, it changes what he is allowed to think about himself. The Vought myth gives him a self to inhabit that does not include the boarding school, or the stolen cocktail sips, or the father's verdict. He gets to be someone else entirely. He takes the offer. What Vought gets in return is something far more valuable than a single hero. They get a proof of concept. Ben, as Soldier Boy, is Vaught's demonstration that a human being can be chemically enhanced into a marketable product. He is Compound V walking around in a patriotic costume, proving to the United States government that this technology works, that it can produce something useful, that Vought is worth keeping around and worth keeping funded. He fights in World War II. Stan Edgar, years later, would confirm that Ben killed Germans by the dozens during the war. Though how much of his combat record was real and how much was Vaught's film crew is never fully settled by the show. What matters is that the government found him credible and Vought found him profitable. And those two things together made him almost impossible to remove. Almost. The relationship between Ben and Vought is worth examining carefully because it looks like loyalty, but functions more like a transaction neither party is fully honest about. Ben performs the role Vought needs. Vought provides the fame and protection Ben needs. As long as both parties are getting what they want, the arrangement holds. The problem is that arrangements built on mutual need rather than mutual respect are fragile in very specific ways. The moment one party decides the other is no longer useful, the whole structure collapses. Vaught's history of doing exactly that to every single hero they have ever manufactured is one of the show's central arguments. And Ben is the clearest example of it playing out in full. Through the 1950s, Ben is a movie star. Through the 1960s, he is a Cold War symbol. Through the 1970s, he is a cultural icon hanging around the Playboy Mansion, lending his image to whatever Vought needs him to lend it to. He leads Payback, the top superhero team of the era. He does what the government asks. The show confirms he participated in cracking down on civil rights protests during the 1960s, and that he was used as part of a government scheme to distribute drugs into black communities. The show is careful here. It confirms he was directed to do the latter by the government, and the former may have been at Vaught's instruction. He did not question his orders. He complied. That compliance is itself a piece of psychology. A man who has been told his entire life that obedience to authority is what makes a real man does not develop the internal language to push back, even when what he is being asked to do is wrong. By the time the 1980s arrive, Ben has been Soldier Boy for 4 decades. He has spent 40 years performing a version of himself that Vought invented. The gap between the performance and the reality has become so wide that it is genuinely unclear, watching him, whether Ben knows the difference anymore. He treats the people around him the way someone treats people who are props in their own story. His teammates in Payback are not colleagues. They are supporting characters. His girlfriend, Crimson Countess, is someone he believes he loves. But his behavior toward her, the constant infidelity, the rationalizations, the assumption that his feelings count more than her experience, looks less like love and more like ownership. This is what Vaught's machine produced. Not a hero, a brand that had learned to mistake itself for a person. The physical reality of what Vought gave Ben is worth understanding clearly. Compound V made him the strongest man alive during his era. He is near invulnerable. He does not age. He has superhuman strength, speed, reflexes, and endurance. During the Nicaragua mission in 1984, he is the only member of Payback who maintains total composure and fights effectively when everything falls apart around them. Grace Mallory, who was on the ground that day and despised him personally, acknowledged his combat effectiveness. Even Homelander, when they eventually meet and fight in Season 3, looks nervous. The physical power is real and enormous. And yet Vought has also been quietly running contingencies since at least 1980. In the fall of 1980, a Vought scientist named Jonah Vogelbaum called Ben into a lab and asked him to provide a genetic sample, telling him it was for research purposes. Ben complied. He was not told what the sample would be used for. What Vogelbaum did with it was create a child. A baby engineered from Ben's genetics who was intended to surpass him entirely. That baby would grow up to be Homelander. Vought had already decided 4 years before Nicaragua that Ben was going to be replaced. They just needed the replacement ready first. This is the timeline the show establishes, and it reframes everything about the Nicaragua betrayal. When Stan Edgar facilitated Payback handing Ben over to the Russians in 1984, he was not acting in a moment of crisis. He was executing a plan that had been in motion for years. Ben was not removed because he became a problem in Nicaragua. He was removed because his replacement was almost ready. And the deal with the Soviets was simply the most efficient way to make him disappear, without the public ever knowing Vought had discarded their greatest hero for a newer model. Ben did not know any of this. He went to Nicaragua believing he was doing what he had always done, operating as Vaught's top asset, leading a government-sanctioned mission, being the thing the country needed him to be. He had no idea that Vought had already looked at him, decided his shelf life was up, and made arrangements. That ignorance is psychologically important. Ben's relationship with Vought was not just transactional. It was, on his side at least, something closer to dependent. Vought was the structure that replaced his father's house. It gave him rules to follow, a role to perform, an authority to serve and be recognized by. The need for validation that his father created did not disappear when Ben became Soldier Boy. It transferred. Vought became the new audience he was performing for, the new authority whose approval he needed, the new structure that could tell him whether he was enough. And like his father, Vought eventually told him he was not. The way Vought discarded him is worth sitting with for a moment. They did not fire him. They did not tell him he was being replaced. They did not give him any indication that his position was under threat. They quietly made a deal with a foreign government to have him captured, experimented on, and held in a facility in Russia for as long as it took Homelander to be ready. The cover story they gave the public, that Soldier Boy heroically sacrificed himself to stop a nuclear meltdown in Ohio was not even slightly true. It was just a story that closed the chapter neatly and let Vought move on without any awkward questions. The nuclear meltdown story is also a perfect piece of Vought psychology. Even in discarding Ben, they gave him a heroic ending. They made his removal look like the ultimate act of self-sacrifice. From a marketing perspective, this is genius. You get to retire your aging product while simultaneously cementing his legacy as a martyr. From a human perspective, it is one of the more quietly sinister things the show depicts, because it means that the man rotting in a Russian facility for 40 years was, simultaneously, being celebrated back home as a legend who died for his country. The world mourned a death that did not happen. The real person was being tortured. What the Vought relationship ultimately reveals about Ben's psychology is the specific vulnerability that his father created. Ben needed to be needed. He needed to be valuable. He needed to believe that the structure he was operating within saw him and recognized his worth. Vought, for decades, gave him exactly that feeling. And like his father, withdrew it without warning and without explanation. The pattern that started in a wealthy house in South Philadelphia repeated itself at the corporate level. You are useful until you are not. You are celebrated until the celebration stops serving us. Then you disappear. The difference is scale. His father sent him to boarding school. Vought sent him to Russia. What neither his father nor Vought ever gave him was the thing that would have actually changed anything. The experience of being valued for something other than his usefulness or his performance. His father wanted a son who embodied a certain idea of strength. Vought wanted a symbol that embodied a certain idea of America. Neither of them wanted Ben. They wanted what Ben could do for them. And the moment that answer changed, Ben became expendable. He spent 40 years in a Russian lab not understanding why. That lack of understanding is one of the most quietly devastating things the show establishes about him. When he comes out of that facility in season 3, beard grown out, disoriented, dangerous, he is not a man who has spent 40 years processing what happened to him. He is a man who has spent 40 years waiting to get back to the life that was taken from him, still believing in the version of events where he was a hero betrayed by circumstance, rather than a product retired by the company that made him. Vought gave Ben the armor. The armor was beautiful and strong, and the whole world admired it. What Vought never gave him was anything worth protecting underneath it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The part of Ben's story that everyone remembers, the part that defines how he behaves in every scene of Season 3, begins not with Vaught's boardroom decisions, but with the people standing right next to him on the ground in Nicaragua. His teammates. The people who were supposed to be the closest thing he had to a family. What they did, why they did it, and what it cost all of them, is where the wound goes from something inherited to something self-created. Section 3. The Nicaragua Betrayal. When everyone you trusted chose to leave you there. 1984 is where the story breaks open. Everything before it, the father, the boarding school, the Vought machine, the decades of performance, is prologue. Nicaragua is where all of those things collide, with a single event that changes the shape of Ben's psychology permanently. Not because what happened there was the worst thing he ever experienced. The 40 years that followed were almost certainly worse, by any measure. But Nicaragua is the moment where the wound his father started and Vought deepened was confirmed by the people who were supposed to be different. His own team. The people who stood next to him in the field. the woman he believed he loved. They all looked at him, made a decision, and chose to leave him there. Understanding what actually happened in Nicaragua requires separating three different versions of the same event, because the show gives all three, and each one reveals something different. The public version, the one Vought released and the government endorsed, said that Soldier Boy heroically gave his life to stop a nuclear meltdown in Ohio. This is a complete fabrication. There was no meltdown. There was no sacrifice. The story was designed by Vought and cleared by the Reagan administration. The show confirms that President Reagan ordered the entire incident covered up, granting Vought full immunity in exchange for the silence. The public mourned a death that did not occur. The legend of Soldier Boy was sealed and made permanent by a lie told at the highest levels of the American government. The version Grace Mallory believed for years was closer to the truth, but still incomplete. Mallory was on the ground that day, leading the CIA side of the operation. Operation Charlie was a real mission. The United States was supporting Contra rebels fighting against the Russian-backed Sandinista government in Nicaragua, secretly funding the operation partly through cocaine smuggling back into the country. Vought brought Payback in as the superhero muscle. Mallory was furious about this from the start. She considered the soups a liability and made no secret of it, which earned her immediate contempt from Ben, who was not accustomed to anyone, especially not a woman, looking down on him. What Mallory saw that day. The camp was attacked by Russian and Nicaraguan forces. The fighting was chaotic and brutal. Gunpowder, for reasons that would only become clear later, was firing in ways that endangered friendly soldiers. Mallory was knocked unconscious, avoiding that friendly fire. When she woke up, she was told Soldier Boy was dead, killed by some kind of superweapon. She believed that story for decades. The actual version is what the show reveals piece by piece across Season 3, and it is darker than either of the other two. Stan Edgar had been planning Ben's removal for years. The 1980 genetic sample, the one Vogelbaum collected under the pretense of research, had already produced a child who would become Homelander. By 1984, Vought had a replacement ready. What they needed was a clean way to remove the original. Edgar found his opportunity in Nicaragua. He made a deal with the Soviet forces operating in the region. Payback would hand Ben over, and in exchange, the Russians would get a compound V-enhanced subject to experiment on. The cover story about the nuclear meltdown would handle the public side of things. What made this plan work was that Edgar did not have to force Payback to cooperate. He just had to offer them an exit from something they already desperately wanted out of. Because Payback hated Ben. Not quietly, not privately. They hated him with the specific intensity of people who have been ground down by someone in power for a long time and have run out of ways to cope with it. Ben had been abusing his position as their leader for the entirety of their time together. He belittled them in front of others. He used his connections to sabotage their individual ambitions whenever those ambitions threatened to make any of them more visible than him. He physically abused some of them. He made their professional lives smaller so that his could stay the biggest thing in the room. Black Noir wanted an acting career. He had the talent for it. He had been told, the show confirms this, that he could have been the Eddie Murphy of superhero cinema if he had gotten the Beverly Hills Cop role that was being cast in the early 1980s. Ben used his personal connections with the film's producer Don Simpson to make sure Noir did not get that role. He then threatened Noir directly, telling him in essence not to try to move up, using a reference to the Jeffersons that made the racial dimension of his message impossible to miss. Noir's face was already hidden behind a mask at all times. Vaught's decision, not his, based on the belief that the public was not ready for a publicly black superhero. Ben did not resist that arrangement. He benefited from it. The mask that erased Noir's identity from public view also kept Noir permanently beneath him. Gunpowder had been Ben's sidekick since he was 14 years old, a teenager. The show confirms that Ben's abuse of Gunpowder began when Gunpowder was a child, slapping him around, hazing that went further than hazing. Gunpowder filed a formal complaint with Vaught's Human Resources Department in August 1983, describing a persistent and relentless pattern of habitual abuse. Vaught buried it. Gunpowder stayed. He had nowhere else to go and no power to leave. Crimson Countess was Ben's girlfriend. She performed the role of his partner while privately finding him intolerable. She did not love him. She had never loved him. She stayed in the relationship for reasons the show does not fully specify, but implies were professional. Ben was the most powerful person in Payback, and the most connected person in Vaught's ecosystem. Leaving him had costs. Staying was its own kind of endurance. These are the people Edgar approached. And when Edgar told them that Ben was going to be removed, that there was a deal in place, that all they had to do was participate in the handover, and Ben would disappear, and they would be free, they agreed. Immediately. Without negotiating, without hesitation, because they had been waiting for exactly this. The events of the mission itself unfolded fast and violently. When Payback turned on Ben, he did not go quietly. He fought back with everything he had. Before Crimson Countess and Mindstorm could fully subdue him, Ben grabbed Black Noir, pinned his face to the hood of a burning Jeep, and bashed his skull repeatedly with his shield. The blows removed a portion of Noir's brain. They shattered his skull, scarred half his face, and inflicted neurological damage that never healed. Black Noir's silence, his internal cartoon world of animal friends, his inability to speak, his strange, fragmented interior life, all of it, every distinctive and unsettling detail about him across the entire show is the direct result of what Ben did to him during those few minutes in Nicaragua. Crimson Countess then dealt the final blow that subdued Ben. The Russians took him, and that was 1984. Now here is the psychological dimension of this that the show makes very precise. Ben spent 40 years in that Russian facility believing a specific story about what had happened to him. He believed his team had been paid. He believed the Russians had made a financial offer and Payback had taken it. That it was a transaction. That it was about money. He held on to Crimson Countess specifically. He told himself that she had been coerced. That she loved him and would have come for him if she could. That somewhere in the world, the woman he believed he loved was waiting, or grieving, or at least guilty. That belief kept him going through the experiments, through the torture, through the coma cycles, through 4 decades of captivity. Psychologically, it gave him something to hold on to. The belief that he had been betrayed for money was terrible, but it was survivable. Money is understandable. Money is a reason. A reason means the betrayal was about circumstances, not about him personally. He could hate his teammates for being weak enough to take a bribe without having to confront the possibility that they chose to leave him because of who he was and how he had treated them. The moment that belief is destroyed is Season 3, Episode 5. Ben arrives at Crimson Countess's trailer. Butcher has already restrained her as a show of good faith. Ben stands in front of the woman he has been thinking about for 40 years. He asks her how much the Russians paid her. He expects a number. He expects confirmation of the story he has been living inside. She tells him they paid nothing. She was not bribed. She was not coerced. She chose to leave him there because she hated him. Because they all hated him. Her exact words, as confirmed by the show, "I hated you. We all did." He kills her immediately after, releases the radiation blast. She becomes a smoldering skeleton. The home around her is destroyed. The speed of the killing matters. There is no pause for processing. There is no visible grief. He does not stand there in silence, absorbing what she said. He moves from hearing the information to eliminating the person who delivered it in what appears to be seconds. That speed is not rage in the simple sense. It is the behavior of someone whose entire psychological structure has just been undermined and who has only one response available to that kind of pain. Because what Crimson Countess told him is not just that she did not love him. She told him that the story he survived on for 40 years was wrong. He did not endure the experiments and the torture because his team was bought. He endured all of it because the people closest to him found him so genuinely unbearable that they handed him to a foreign government for free, out of pure relief. That is a different thing entirely. The money version of the betrayal is survivable because it is external. The real version, no payment, pure hatred, collective agreement, is a mirror. It says that the way he treated people produced this outcome. It says the abuse he inflicted, the careers he sabotaged, the people he ground down, was not just bad behavior. It was the cause. He was handed to the Russians because of who he was, not because of circumstances. The wound his father started, "You are not enough. You are a disappointment. You are not worth the effort," just got confirmed by every person who was supposed to know him best. He cannot hold that. He does not have the tools to hold that. The show does not give Ben a breakdown scene after Crimson Countess dies. There is no moment where he sits with what he has just learned. He moves on. He keeps hunting. He finds Mindstorm and kills him. He keeps moving forward because forward is the only direction he has ever known. Stopping means feeling, and feeling is the thing he was taught, from the earliest age possible, is the one thing he must never do. Grace Mallory, who watched that day in Nicaragua from the ground, once described Ben as someone who could not read a room, who always assumed women were charmed by his behavior when they actually despised him. She is describing someone who has so thoroughly lost contact with how he is actually being received by the people around him that he has constructed an entirely alternate reality to live inside. The gap between who Ben thinks he is, celebrated, beloved, the most impressive person present, and who Ben actually is to the people around him, is enormous. Nicaragua is where that gap finally became impossible to ignore. He ignores it anyway. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 40 years in a Russian laboratory would have broken most people. What it did to Ben is something more specific and more disturbing than simple breaking. Because Ben came out of that facility still recognizably himself, still carrying every behavior and every belief he went in with, and still unable to name what had been done to him or why. What the Russians found when they opened that pod, and what they spent 4 decades doing to the person inside it, is where the physical and psychological damage become impossible to separate from each other. Section 4. 40 years in a pod. What Russian captivity did to his mind and body. The Russians did not kill him. That was never the plan. A dead Compound V subject is just a body. A living one is a laboratory. What the Soviet scientists who received Ben in 1984 understood immediately was that they had been handed something extraordinarily rare. A human being enhanced by a formula they did not possess, kept alive and functional by biology that defied everything normal medicine understood about the human body. Ben did not age. He did not deteriorate the way a normal prisoner would. He could survive things that would kill anyone else. From a purely scientific standpoint, he was the most valuable research subject they had ever had access to. So they used him accordingly. The show does not depict the full 40 years of what happened inside that Russian facility. What it shows is enough. The experiments were extensive, repeated, and designed with no concern whatsoever for Ben's experience of them. He was subjected to high levels of radiation as part of the testing, levels that would have killed an unenhanced person almost instantly. His body absorbed that radiation over decades until his physiology was fundamentally altered. He became, in the show's own description, a living nuclear reactor. His body now produces radiation continuously, at all times, simply as a function of existing. The intensity of that radiation is tied directly to his emotional state. When he is calm, it is manageable. When he is distressed, it spikes. When his trauma is triggered, it can become catastrophic. That connection between his emotional state and his body's output is one of the more precise things the show does with his character. His body literally cannot separate feeling from consequence anymore. The 40 years of experiments did not just change his biology. They created a direct physical channel between his internal psychological state and his external destructive capacity. When Ben is scared, things explode. When Ben is in pain, buildings come down. The trauma did not stay internal. It was written into his physiology. The other confirmed detail about the experimentation is the coma cycles. Ben was held in a containment pod, induced into unconsciousness, brought back out, tested, and returned to the pod repeatedly across 4 decades. This means that his experience of time during captivity was not continuous. He was not awake for 40 years of suffering. He was in and out, conscious long enough to be experimented on, to feel what was being done to him, and then sedated again. This is its own specific kind of psychological damage. Normal humans process trauma partly through the passage of time, through routine, through the small daily rhythms that create a sense of continuity. Ben had none of that. He had the pod, the experiments, the sedation, and then the pod again. No continuity, no rhythm. No way to build any kind of psychological framework around what was happening to him. He came out in 2022, when the boys accidentally freed him during their Moscow mission, having not aged a single day from 1984. Physically, he looked exactly as he had when he went in. Psychologically, the damage was invisible from the outside and enormous on the inside. The first thing that happens after he escapes the Russian facility demonstrates both of these things simultaneously. He makes his way out of the building. He steals clothes. He smuggles himself onto a commercial flight back to the United States. These actions require planning, awareness, and the ability to move through a complex environment without being caught. Ben does all of them successfully, which tells you that the core of his intelligence and his tactical ability survived intact. He is not broken in the ways that are visible. He can function. He can move through the world. He can pass. Then he reaches Manhattan. He walks the streets of a city he has not seen in nearly 40 years. Everything around him is changed. The technology, the culture, the way people dress and talk and move. He is disoriented in the specific way of someone who was removed from the world at one moment in history and deposited back into a completely different one. The show confirms this through his behavior and his dialogue across Season 3. He uses outdated expressions, references things from the 1970s and early 1980s as if they are current, and is genuinely confused by aspects of modern life that everyone around him takes for granted. His frame of reference stopped updating in 1984. While he is walking through Manhattan, he hears music coming from a nearby radio. It is a Russian pop song called Pobeg, which translates to escape. The song was written and performed by Mikhail Shufutinsky and released in 1983. It was played during the experiments, during the torture. During the periods when he was conscious enough to hear what was happening around him and fully aware of what was being done to his body. That song is the soundtrack of the worst thing that ever happened to him, played on repeat across years until his nervous system fused the sound with the experience so completely that one cannot occur without the other being triggered. He hears it on a Manhattan street in 2022, and the 40 years collapse instantly. The flashbacks begin. The memories of the facility, the experiments, the captivity, come flooding back with full force. He cannot stop them. He cannot manage them. The trauma response overtakes him entirely. And because his emotional state is now directly connected to his radiation output, the result is a radiation blast that kills 19 civilians and destroys a significant portion of a 5-story apartment building. 19 people die because a song came out of a radio. That detail is not presented as a villain moment by the show. It is presented as a consequence. A direct line between what was done to Ben in that Russian facility and what happened on a Manhattan street decades later. He did not choose to hurt those people. He did not make a decision. His body responded to his trauma the way his trauma always responded, with destruction. The experiment that altered his physiology made his psychological damage physically dangerous to everyone around him in a way that no amount of willpower or awareness could fully control. When the boys eventually team up with Ben in Season 3, they manage his PTSD with heavy doses of marijuana supplied by Butcher. This works to a degree. It dulls his response enough to keep him functional most of the time. But it comes with its own costs. The marijuana increases his paranoia significantly. During a scene in the woods while hunting Mindstorm, Ben starts hearing things that are not there. He becomes convinced that a priest and a nun whose car has broken down on the road are actually Mindstorm's mind-controlled agents sent to kill them. He shoots both of them. As it happens, his suspicion turns out to be correct. They were Mindstorm's agents. But the show frames the sequence carefully, making it clear that Ben's reasoning was not sound. He acted on paranoid suspicion, not on genuine evidence. And the fact that he turned out to be right is coincidence rather than judgment. That sequence is a precise picture of what his management tools actually look like in practice. The marijuana suppresses the trigger response, but amplifies the paranoia that was already embedded in his psychology from the captivity. There is no clean solution. There is no version of Ben post-Russia that does not carry serious, active, uncontrolled damage. The options available to him and to the people around him are all bad. Manage the trigger and increase the paranoia. Remove the marijuana and risk the radiation blasts. There is no third option that leads somewhere healthier, because the source of the damage, 4 decades of torture and forced experimentation, is not something that can be undone. The show also establishes something significant about how Ben understands what happened to him. He refuses, explicitly and firmly, to acknowledge that he has what would today be called post-traumatic stress disorder. When the subject comes up, he dismisses it. In his framing, What he experienced in Russia is something he lived through and moved past. He uses the language of his era. The word that existed for this condition in his time was shell shock, and he treats that framing as something that applies to weaker men, not to him. Acknowledging the PTSD would require acknowledging vulnerability. Acknowledging vulnerability is the one thing his entire psychology was constructed to prevent. This refusal is not denial in a simple, obvious sense. It is not Ben saying the experiments did not happen or that Russia was not difficult. It is Ben insisting that what happened there did not break him in any way that counts, that he survived it because he is strong, and that strength means he does not carry damage. The logic is completely circular and completely consistent with everything he was taught about being a man. Real strength means not being hurt. He survived. Therefore, he was not hurt. Therefore, he does not have PTSD. Therefore, anyone suggesting otherwise is questioning his strength, which is an attack he will not tolerate. Meanwhile, his body detonates when it hears a song. The gap between what Ben believes about himself and what is demonstrably true is never wider than in these moments. The show does not editorialize heavily. It does not need to. It simply shows you the man saying he is fine, and then shows you the Geiger counter spiking whenever he talks about his past. When Huey holds the Geiger counter near Ben during a conversation where Ben is venting about his history, the radiation levels climb measurably and visibly. His body is reporting what his words refuse to. He is not fine. He has never been fine. The technology in Huey's hand is telling a more honest story about Ben's internal state than Ben himself is capable of telling. The attempted suicide is where the depth of the PTSD damage becomes impossible to ignore, even for the show's other characters. When the boys decide to stop Ben from killing Homelander, because Homelander is also Ben's biological son, and Ben cannot bring himself to acknowledge that relationship in any healthy way. They move to subdue him and return him to containment. Ben's response to the threat of being put back in a pod is to begin overcharging his radiation output to lethal levels. The Villains Wiki, drawing directly from the show's events, confirms that this overcharge was intentional. Ben was attempting to detonate himself, to die rather than be imprisoned again. His body begins to visibly overheat. He starts emitting smoke. The radiation levels climb toward a point that the show indicates would be catastrophic, not just for him, but for everyone in the building. The fear of the pod, of being sedated and contained and used again, is so overwhelming that the alternative of non-existence feels preferable. That is where the PTSD has taken him. Not just to flashbacks and paranoid shooting in the woods, all the way to a place where being alive inside a box is less tolerable than not being alive at all. Queen Maeve stops the detonation by grabbing Ben and jumping through a window, taking the blast mid-air. She survives, but loses an eye and her powers permanently. Ben survives and is put back into stasis. He wakes up again in Season 5 when Homelander frees him. But the man who wakes up from that second period of captivity is carrying everything he carried before, plus the additional weight of knowing that the boys, people he had been working alongside, people he had opened up to, people like Butcher, who he had actually talked to about his real life, chose to betray him too. The pattern that started with his father and continued through Vought and through Payback repeated itself one more time. He trusted. He was used. He was discarded. Russia did not create that pattern. Russia simply confirmed it with 40 years of evidence, and then permanently attached it to his nervous system, so that a song on a radio could make it feel like it was still happening. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Coming out of Russia, Ben does everything someone in his position would predictably do. He hunts the people who put him there, one by one, with a focus and a fury that looks like strength from the outside. What the hunt actually is, underneath all of that motion and violence, is something the show reveals slowly and carefully, through the specific way Ben starts behaving the moment he believes he might have found the one relationship that could give him what he never had. Section 5. The Revenge Tour. What hunting payback actually reveals about Ben. When Ben walks out of that Russian facility in 2022, he has one thing on his mind. Not recovery, not adjustment, not figuring out how to exist in a world that moved on without him for nearly 4 decades. The first thing he does after stealing clothes and smuggling himself onto a flight back to America is go looking for the people who handed him to the Russians. Every decision he makes in the early part of Season 3 flows from that single direction. Find them, make them face what they did, destroy them. On the surface, this looks like justice, and there is a version of that reading that holds up. These people did participate in handing him to a foreign government to be tortured for 40 years, and none of them faced any consequences for it. The world thought he died heroically. They walked free. Crimson Countess ended up at a theme park doing performances for families. Gunpowder became a Second Amendment spokesman at gun conventions. Mindstorm was living in isolation in the woods. The TNT twins were hosting Herogasm. None of them were punished. None of them were even publicly connected to what happened. So the revenge reading is not wrong. What makes it incomplete is everything the show layers underneath it. The specific way Ben pursues each person, what he says and does in those encounters, and what each confrontation reveals about what the revenge is actually for. Start with Gunpowder, because Gunpowder is actually found by Butcher first, not by Ben directly. But the information Butcher extracts from Gunpowder is the first real portrait of what Ben was like as a leader, delivered by someone who experienced it firsthand. Gunpowder describes the abuse as hazing that went too far. He downplays it, minimizes it, uses the softest possible language for it even after Butcher has beaten the truth out of him. He says Ben never touched him in the way the complaint letter implied. He insists it was physical hazing, not sexual abuse, and that the formal complaint he filed was just about the violence going further than it should have. Even in this minimized version, what Gunpowder describes is a man who used his power over a teenage boy to establish control through physical force. Gunpowder was 14 when he joined Payback. He was a child under Ben's authority, and Ben hit him. The complaint Gunpowder filed in 1983 used the phrase habitual abuse. Not a one-time incident, not hazing that got out of hand once, but a persistent and repeated pattern. Vaught buried that complaint. Gunpowder stayed. He had no real choice. Ben was the most powerful person in his professional world, and the institution that was supposed to protect him had decided the complaint was not worth acting on. What this reveals about Ben's revenge tour is important context. The people he is hunting are not innocent bystanders who made a single bad decision under pressure. They are people he abused over years, who eventually found a way out of that abuse and took it. The moral picture here is genuinely complicated, and the show does not simplify it. Ben's suffering in Russia was real and severe and undeserved in any proportional sense. The behavior that made his teammates willing to hand him over is also real and documented and genuinely harmful. Both things are true at the same time, and the show holds both without resolving them into something cleaner. Ben cannot hold both. He can only hold one. The version where he was betrayed by people he trusted, people he had given everything to, people who owed him loyalty and chose money over it. The version where his own behavior created the conditions for the betrayal is not available to him. Not because he is stupid, because looking at that version would require looking at himself honestly. And that is the one thing his entire psychological architecture was built to prevent. The Crimson Countess confrontation is the clearest window into this. By the time Ben arrives at her trailer, Butcher has already chained her to a chair. This is Butcher's show of good faith. He is using her as bait to bring Ben in and begin their working arrangement. Crimson Countess knows Ben is coming. She is visibly terrified. She has known since the moment she heard he escaped from Russia that this meeting was going to happen eventually, and she has had no way to stop it. Ben walks in. He has not seen her since Nicaragua. For 40 years, she has existed in his mind as the woman he loved, the woman he believed would have come for him, the woman who was either coerced or paid into participating in something she did not choose. He has carried a specific story about her across 4 decades of torture, and that story was a lifeline. He asks how much they paid her. The way he asks matters. He asks as though he already knows the answer is going to be a number. He asks as someone who has rehearsed this confrontation so many times in his head that he knows the shape of it. There will be a confession. There will be a dollar amount. There will be the bitter satisfaction of having the transaction confirmed. He can handle a transaction. A transaction is external. A transaction says she was weak. She was bought. She was human in the worst way. But the thing she sold was not connected to who he is or how he treated her. She tells him there was no payment. She tells him she hated him. She tells him they all did. The show does not give Ben a long reaction to this. There is no extended scene of him processing what he just heard. He destroys her almost immediately. But the information lands, and the show makes sure the audience feels it land, even if Ben cannot afford to let himself feel it for more than a moment. The detail the villain's wiki confirms that Ben was genuinely shocked, that he truly believed she had loved him and would have rescued him, that her answer was not what any part of him was prepared for, tells the whole story of what that moment actually was. He spent 40 years in pain holding on to a belief that turned out to be completely false. The love he thought he had was never there. The loyalty he assumed was behind him did not exist. The suffering he endured was not the result of money changing hands or external pressure applied to people who cared for him. It was the unanimous, uncompensated, freely chosen decision of people who knew him well and found him genuinely unbearable. He kills her and moves on. The TNT twins are next, and they die at Herogasm, the annual gathering of soups that Ben's former Payback teammates, the TNT twins, are hosting. This confrontation is where the second PTSD episode happens in public, because the twins tell Ben during the encounter that Black Noir was the one who led the betrayal, who was the key figure in organizing the handover. Ben does not believe this at first. He refuses to accept it. The show confirms that despite being repeatedly told that Noir led the attack on him, Ben initially rejected the information because he had beaten Noir down more than once and could not reconcile that history of dominance with the idea that Noir had been capable of organizing something this significant against him. That refusal is revealing. Ben's model of human behavior is built around power. Who has it? Who does not? Who is above who? In his mind, he was above Noir. Noir was someone he had dominated, someone whose face he had shoved into a burning jeep, someone who had been permanently damaged by him. In Ben's psychology, people beneath him do not organize things against him. They absorb what he dishes out and stay in place. The idea that Noir, of all people, had been the one to facilitate his removal requires Ben to update a fundamental assumption about how power works. And that kind of update is not something he does easily or willingly. But then his PTSD triggers at Herogasm. Escape plays somewhere in the building. The flashbacks come. The blast goes off. The building is destroyed. Multiple guests die. The TNT twins are vaporized. Ben does not control this. He does not choose it. His body responds to the trigger the same way it always does, completely and destructively. And the people around him absorb the consequences. After Herogasm, the hunt continues toward Mindstorm. Mindstorm is one of the two remaining members of Payback alive at this point, Black Noir being the other. He has been living in isolation in the woods, which is itself a kind of psychological portrait. A man with the ability to trap people inside their own minds, living alone, far from everyone. His power made him useful. His isolation suggests he was aware of what he was capable of and chose distance as a form of control. He is not thriving. He is hiding. When Ben and Huey and Butcher find him, Mindstorm attacks Butcher first, trapping him in an endless loop of his own traumatic memories, specifically his childhood, the abuse his father inflicted on him and his brother. Butcher is locked in that loop and will die of dehydration if no one breaks it. Only Mindstorm can release him. Ben's response to this situation is to say that only Mindstorm can help, and then prepare to kill Mindstorm anyway. Huey stops him, argues that they need Mindstorm alive long enough to save Butcher. Ben does not particularly care about Butcher's survival, beyond his usefulness to the mission. He was going to eliminate Mindstorm, and the problem of Butcher was secondary. Huey's insistence is what keeps Butcher alive. Eventually, Mindstorm is made to release Butcher, and then Ben kills him. The pattern across all of these confrontations is consistent. Ben moves through each one with absolute efficiency. He gathers what information is available, he eliminates the person, and he moves to the next target. There is no visible hesitation, no grief, no moment where the killing produces any evident emotional response. From the outside, this looks like the controlled behavior of someone who has completely mastered their feelings and operates from pure purpose. The inside story is something different. During the walk through the woods between the Herogasm aftermath and the hunt for Mindstorm, something happens that cracks the surface of the controlled exterior open just slightly. Ben starts talking, not about the mission, about himself. He talks to Butcher. Of all the people available, Butcher is the one Ben opens up to. About his real childhood. The wealthy father, the neglect, the boarding school, the Compound V trials, and his father's response. The show confirms that this conversation is something Ben has almost certainly never had before. His fabricated public biography replaced his real one so completely and for so long that he has had no occasion and no context in which to tell the actual story. Butcher is a stranger, essentially, a man Ben has known for days. But something about Butcher, the shared anger, the similar damage, the fact that Butcher is operating outside any structure that has power over Ben, makes the conversation possible in a way it has not been with anyone else. Huey notices something during this period that the show flags clearly. When he holds the Geiger counter near Ben while Ben is talking about his past, the radiation levels climb. The emotional distress is registering physically. Ben's body is responding to the act of remembering and talking about his history in measurable, visible ways. He is not fine. He is not past it. The story he is telling Butcher about being the son of a man who called him a disappointment is still active inside him, in the most literal, physical sense possible. And then Huey expresses concern about Butcher being unconscious, and Ben punches him in the face. The shift is instantaneous. One moment Ben is talking about the most painful parts of his history in a way he almost never does. The next moment, someone expresses care for another person in his presence, and he responds with violence. The connection is not hard to trace. Emotional openness, even observed emotional openness, is the trigger. Vulnerability in any form, in any direction, is the thing he cannot tolerate. He was taught that you do not get scared. You do not need help. You do not show that something is difficult. The punch is not random. It is the trained response activating the instant the emotional territory gets too close to somewhere real. The Revenge Tour, taken as a whole, is a portrait of someone moving very fast to avoid standing still. Because standing still means feeling what Crimson Countess told him. Standing still means sitting with the knowledge that the people he abused chose to leave him there, not because they were paid, but because of him. Moving through targets, eliminating each one, maintaining the forward momentum of purpose and fury. All of that is the psychological alternative to stopping and looking honestly at what his 40 years of absence actually cost, and who was responsible for creating the conditions that made it possible. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. All of that movement, all of that revenge and fury and forward motion eventually runs into the one thing Ben was not remotely prepared for, the revelation that changes the shape of his entire story. Not just what it means for him going forward, but what it means looking backward across everything that came before. The moment he finds out, he has a son. Section 6. The son he never knew. Homelander, fatherhood, and the wound that reproduces itself. The phone call happens in Season 3, Episode 7. Ben calls Homelander. He has a specific reason for making the call. He wants to set up a meeting, to use Homelander as part of the plan against Vought. That is the tactical purpose. But before he gets to any of that, he tells Homelander something. He tells him about 1980. About Vogelbaum calling him into a lab and asking him to provide a genetic sample. About how he was told it was for research. About how in 1981, Vogelbaum used that sample to create a child. He tells Homelander that child is him. The show has been building toward this moment since the season began. The pieces have been laid down carefully across multiple episodes. The audience has had time to understand both men separately before watching them process the same information at the same time. What makes the scene work as a piece of psychology is not just the revelation itself, but the specific way each man responds to it. Because their responses are almost perfectly opposite. And that opposition tells you everything about where each of them is emotionally. Homelander's response is immediate and enormous. He has spent his entire existence longing for a family, for a parent, for anyone who is connected to him by something other than fear or usefulness. He was created in a lab, raised in a facility, denied any genuine human connection from birth. The news that he has a biological father, that there is someone in the world who shares his genetics, someone who was there first, someone from whom he comes, lands on him like the thing he has been waiting for his whole life. He wants to meet. He wants to talk. He wants whatever version of a father-son relationship is still available to them. Ben's response is quieter and harder to read, which is itself information. He does not immediately express warmth. He does not say he is glad to know. He uses the information to arrange a meeting, framing it around the plan rather than around the relationship. When Homelander arrives and begins to pour out his need, the desperation, the longing, the confession of how much he has always wanted exactly this, Ben listens. And then, in episode 8, he rejects him. Not gently, not with any acknowledgement of what Homelander just offered him. He calls him a weak, sniveling person starved for attention. He calls him a disappointment. He tells him that if he had raised him, he could have made him better, but there is no fixing what Homelander has become now. Those are his father's words, almost exactly. The show establishes this connection clearly, and Screen Rant's analysis of the scene, drawn directly from the show's own framing, makes the psychology explicit. Ben hates himself. He has spent his entire life running from the verdict his father delivered, and never escaping it. When Homelander stands in front of him and displays exactly the qualities Ben was never allowed to show, the need, the vulnerability, the open desperation for love, Ben sees himself. The self he suppressed. The self he was told was weak and unacceptable and deserving of rejection. And because he hates that self, he cannot look at Homelander without hating what he sees. He then does to Homelander exactly what his father did to him. He delivers the rejection. He uses the diminishing language. He withdraws the approval that Homelander came there desperate to receive. He does not plan this consciously. He is not thinking about his father in that moment, or making a deliberate choice to replicate the abuse. He simply does not have any other model available. The only template he has ever had for how a father behaves toward a son is the one his own father gave him. And that template says that need is weakness. Weakness deserves contempt, and contempt is how you respond to weakness. The Villains Wiki notes this carefully, that Ben insulted and tried to kill Homelander for being weak and needy, abusing him the way his own father had abused him, and that this is arguably less about hypocrisy and more about projection. He is not consciously punishing Homelander for the same crime he himself committed. He is unconsciously redirecting his father's verdict onto the person in front of him, who most reminds him of the part of himself he cannot forgive. This is one of the more psychologically precise things the show does across its entire run. The damage does not just affect Ben, it moves through him. It finds the next person in the line and delivers itself there. His father rejected him. He absorbed that rejection, built his life around escaping it. And then the moment he is faced with his own biological child expressing the same need he himself carried, he cannot stop the pattern from completing itself. He becomes his father. Not because he wants to, because he never had any other instruction. The ambivalence, though, is real, and the show tracks it carefully. Because Ben does not only reject Homelander. The Villains Wiki confirms that Ben genuinely believed and said directly that if he had known Homelander was his son earlier, if Vought had kept him around instead of handing him to the Russians, he would have willingly stepped back and let Homelander take the spotlight as his successor. He said he would have raised him. He said he would have done it differently, done it better than his father did it for him. There is something in Ben that recognizes the possibility of a different kind of fatherhood, even if he cannot access that possibility in the actual moment when Homelander is standing in front of him, needing it. That gap between what Ben can imagine and what Ben can actually do is where the tragedy of the father-son dynamic lives. He can conceive of being a better father than his father was. He cannot become that father in practice because the tools were never given to him, and the damage runs too deep. The imagined version of himself as a good father exists in the abstract. The real version, in the hallway, with Homelander in front of him. That version defaults to the only pattern he knows. The Season 5 dimension of this relationship adds another layer that the show has been building toward. And the analysis from Comic Basics, drawing from the show's current season, describes the dynamic with real precision. Even in Season 5, when Ben and Homelander are nominally aligned and working together, the relationship does not feel genuinely parental. Multiple sources analyzing the current season note that Ben's alignment with Homelander reads as strategic rather than emotional, that he appears to be playing a longer game, waiting for the right moment, with his actual goal possibly being leadership of the Seven for himself rather than any real paternal investment in Homelander's well-being. Whether that reading is accurate depends on how Season 5 resolves. But the behavior that supports it is consistent with everything established about Ben across the show. He does not form genuine bonds. He forms arrangements. Every relationship in his life has functioned as a transaction at some level. With Vought, with Payback, with Crimson Countess, with Butcher during the brief alliance of Season 3. The idea that fatherhood would operate differently, that it would produce something more honest and less strategic, requires a kind of emotional availability that Ben has never demonstrated and was never taught. There is also the detail about gunpowder, which the show presents as the closest thing to a genuine paternal relationship Ben ever managed. Among all of his Payback teammates, Gunpowder received the least brutal treatment. The Villains Wiki is careful to note that while Ben did physically abuse Gunpowder, who was a child when he joined Payback, his treatment of Gunpowder was nowhere near as severe as his treatment of the other members. The show suggests this is because Ben saw Gunpowder as a kind of surrogate son figure, someone he could mentor and shape in his own image. The relatively gentler treatment, and the qualifier relatively is doing a lot of work there, given that he was still hitting a teenager, is interpreted as Ben's desire to be a father expressing itself in the only way available to him, which was authority and occasional physicality rather than warmth or genuine care. He wanted to raise a child better than his father raised him. What he produced was someone who filed a formal abuse complaint at age 14. The intention and the outcome are so far apart that they function almost as a definition of what unprocessed damage does when it tries to reproduce itself differently. Ben did not want to be his father to Gunpowder. He wanted to be something better. He could not get there, because wanting to be something better is not the same as having the tools to be something better. And no one had ever given Ben those tools. The Homelander revelation also reframes Ben's earlier statement about wanting to have children with Crimson Countess someday and raise them better than his father raised him. That desire was genuine. The Villains Wiki confirms it. Ben told people he wanted kids, wanted to do the father thing differently, wanted to give a child what he had not been given. That desire existed in him across his entire adult life. And the tragedy is that he did have a child, without knowing it, without consenting to it, without any opportunity to be present. And when that child finally found him, Ben could not give him anything different from what he himself received. Homelander standing in front of Ben confessing his need for a father is one of the most painful scenes the show has produced. And it is painful specifically because the audience can see both men clearly at the same time. They can see Homelander's genuine desperation, the real and enormous wound of a man who was denied a parent from birth and is now finally standing in front of the person his biology comes from. And they can see Ben's inability to respond to that desperation with anything other than the verdict his own father gave him. replicated word for word, handed down one more generation. The show is making a specific argument through this scene and through the entire father-son architecture of Season 3. Eric Kripke said it directly in his Variety interview. The theme of the season is how ideas about what makes a man get passed down from fathers to sons, generation after generation, without anyone stopping to examine what those ideas are actually doing. Ben is the clearest example of this argument the show has. He is not just a damaged person, he is a transmission point. The damage that came into him from his father moves through him and comes out the other side pointed at Homelander, who then points it at Ryan, and the line continues. The word the show and its creators use for this is intergenerational trauma. The way it works in Ben's story is not subtle. His father told him he was a disappointment. He told Homelander the same thing. His father withheld approval no matter what Ben achieved. Ben withheld approval from Homelander in the exact moment Homelander offered the most honest version of himself. His father sent him away rather than engage with the difficulty of raising him. Ben, faced with the option of acknowledging his son and building something, chose rejection instead. The machinery of the damage is identical across 2 generations. Only the scale changes. Ben's father rejected a wealthy young man who wanted to be a soldier. Ben rejected the most powerful being on Earth. The feelings involved, the need, the hope, the crushing withdrawal of what was hoped for, are the same size in both cases. Feelings do not scale with power. Homelander, for all his strength, experiences the rejection from his biological father with the same rawness that Ben experienced his father's verdict as a child. That is what the show is arguing through this relationship. And it is an argument that is uncomfortable precisely because it is true, not just for fictional superpowered characters, but for the real pattern it is describing. The way emotional damage moves through family lines when nobody stops it, when nobody names it, when nobody has the tools or the language or the permission to say that something is broken and needs to be looked at honestly. Ben never had those tools. Homelander, shaped by Ben's absence and by Vought's deliberate emotional destruction of him, does not have them either. Ryan, watching Homelander laser a man's head off in public, is absorbing his own set of instructions about what strength looks like and what men are allowed to feel. The line does not stop with Ben. The show is very clear about that. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The father-son dynamic with Homelander is the most visible relationship in Ben's Season 3 arc. But there is another relationship running underneath it that reveals something different about him, something quieter and more surprising. A genuine moment of connection that the show uses to make a specific point about what Ben might have been if the damage had been caught earlier. That relationship is with Butcher, and what it shows about Ben is the most unexpected thing in his entire arc. Section 7. The Butcher Connection. 2 broken men, and the brief moment one of them almost opened up. Billy Butcher and Ben should not get along. On paper, they are completely incompatible. Butcher is a man who has spent years dedicated to the destruction of every superhero he can get his hands on. Ben is the original superhero, the template all the others were built from, the most powerful man alive for most of the 20th century. Butcher's entire professional identity is built around the belief that supes are dangerous, that power corrupts absolutely, that the only responsible thing to do with a compound V-enhanced human being is remove them from the equation permanently. Ben represents everything Butcher has organized his life around hating. And yet across the middle section of Season 3, something happens between them that the show presents carefully and without overstating it. They talk, genuinely, in a way that Ben does not talk to anyone else across his entire arc in the series. Not to Homelander, not to Crimson Countess in their final confrontation, not to Huey, not to anyone from his past. With Butcher, and only with Butcher, Ben says things about himself that appear to be true rather than performed. Understanding why requires understanding what Butcher offers that nobody else does. Butcher is not impressed by Ben. That sounds simple, but it is actually rare in Ben's world. His entire life has been structured around being the most impressive person present, the strongest, the most celebrated, the most powerful, the most recognized. Everyone around him has historically responded to him through the lens of what he is, rather than who he is. Fans celebrated the symbol. Teammates feared the authority. Vought used the asset. Crimson Countess endured the man. Even Homelander approaches Ben through the specific desperation of needing something from him. Butcher approaches Ben as a tool, a weapon to be pointed at Homelander and fired. He does not have reverence for Soldier Boy the legend. He does not have fear of Ben the person. He has a use for Ben's power, and he manages that use with the same cold pragmatism he applies to everything. From Butcher's side, this is entirely transactional, and he makes no secret of it. But from Ben's side, that absence of performance expectation creates something unusual. There is no audience to play to with Butcher. There is no image to maintain. Butcher already knows Ben is difficult and damaged and dangerous. He went looking for those qualities deliberately. The mask that Ben wears around everyone else, the Soldier Boy persona, the macho performance, the aggressive dismissal of anything soft, none of it is necessary with Butcher, because Butcher is not there for the performance. He is there for the weapon underneath it. That unusual dynamic is what creates the space for the conversation in the woods. During the stretch of Season 3 where Ben and Butcher and Huey are moving through the wilderness hunting Mindstorm, Ben starts talking. The show does not frame this as a big moment or a major scene. It happens as they move, almost incidentally. The way real conversations between people sometimes happen when there is no eye contact and no formal setting, and the pressure of being watched is reduced. Ben talks about his father. He talks about the real version of his childhood, the wealthy house, the distant and abusive father, the boarding school, the Compound V trials, the verdict his father delivered when he came home as the strongest man alive. The show confirms through the Villains Wiki and through the broader narrative framing that this conversation is almost certainly the first time Ben has told this story to anyone. His public biography was a Vought fabrication that he inhabited so completely and for so long that there would have been no occasion and no safe context in which to tell the real one. His teammates in Payback were people he needed to perform dominance for, not people he could be honest with. The celebrity world he moved through in the 1950s and 1970s was built entirely on image. Even with Crimson Countess, who he believed was his closest relationship, the dynamic was one of ownership and performance rather than genuine honesty. With Butcher, walking through the woods toward another violent confrontation, Ben tells the actual story. Huey's Geiger counter registers what this costs him. The radiation levels climb measurably while Ben talks. His body is reporting the emotional weight of what he is saying in the only language it has left, the language of heat and radiation and physical output. He is distressed. He is not showing it in any conventional way. He is not crying, not hesitating, not soft in any visible sense. He is telling the story in the flat, matter-of-fact tone of someone who has decided that this information is just information, that it does not mean anything, that sharing it is simply an act of communication rather than vulnerability. But the Geiger counter knows better. Butcher listens. This is also worth noting. Butcher, who is not a gentle man and not a patient one, who uses people as efficiently as Ben does and discards them with similar ease, listens to what Ben is telling him. The show does not make this into a warm moment. Butcher is not offering comfort or sympathy. He is absorbing information the way a person absorbs information about someone they are working with, trying to understand the shape of what they are dealing with. But he does not shut it down. He does not respond with contempt. He lets Ben talk. Then Huey says something caring about Butcher, who is at this point unconscious and in danger from Mindstorm's attack, and Ben punches Huey in the face. The speed of that shift is the whole point. Jensen Ackles described this scene directly in his interview and explained what Ben is doing in the moment he says he does not get scared, that he just does not feel it. Ackles said Ben does not allow himself to have those feelings because he cannot. He was told to be tough, and that instruction went so deep that it became structural. The punch is not a change of topic. It is Ben's nervous system responding to emotional proximity the way it always has. Someone expressed vulnerability in his presence. The response is physical and immediate and complete. But the conversation happened. The story got told. And the fact that it happened with Butcher, of all people, says something specific about what Ben actually needed across his entire life and never found a safe container for. He needed someone who was not performing for him and not asking him to perform. Someone whose presence did not require the soldier boy mask. Someone with enough of their own damage to recognize his without making it into a weakness to be used against him. Butcher, almost accidentally, was that person. For a window of days in the middle of Season 3. Not because Butcher is kind or therapeutic or particularly interested in Ben's well-being, but because Butcher's complete disinterest in Ben's legend created the only space Ben had ever occupied where the legend was not required. The parallel between the two men is one the show constructs deliberately, and the Fangasm analysis essay about Season 3 addresses directly. Both men had abusive fathers. Both men absorbed the message that strength means not feeling, that real men do not show what is happening inside them, that moving forward is the only acceptable response to pain. Both men converted their damage into a professional identity, built around controlled aggression and the targeting of external enemies. Both men are, underneath all of that, running from something they have never looked at directly. Butcher's nightmare sequence, when Mindstorm traps him in a loop of his own traumatic memories, shows him reliving his father's abuse of him and his brother, and shows him seeing himself transform into his father. That image, Butcher becoming the thing he most hates and most fears, is the same transformation that Ben completed without ever being forced to watch it happen. Ben did not have a nightmare sequence where he saw himself become his father. He just became his father, in real time, in a hallway with Homelander. And the show let the audience watch it without giving Ben the awareness of what he was doing. Butcher at least has the nightmare. He is forced to see the pattern, even if seeing it in a dreamscape does not guarantee he will break it in waking life. Ben has no equivalent moment of forced recognition. He moves through his arc never fully understanding the connection between what was done to him and what he does to others. The alliance between them breaks in the Season 3 finale, and the way it breaks is entirely consistent with everything established about Ben's relationship with trust. Butcher turns on Ben. The specific trigger is Ben trying to kill Ryan, Homelander's son, The child Butcher has a complicated and painful investment in protecting. When Ben and Homelander are fighting, and the situation escalates toward Ben releasing a blast that would kill Ryan along with everyone else nearby, Butcher intervenes. He shoots Ben with a laser blast to stop him. This is a direct violation of their arrangement and of the implicit understanding between them. Butcher had told Ben that Homelander was his son, had used that information to try to direct Ben's anger. When Butcher then chooses Ryan over the plan, over Ben, Ben experiences it as the most familiar thing in the world. Another person he trusted chose someone else. The show does not give Ben a long speech about this. He does not process it out loud. He is subdued and put back into stasis. But the pattern is complete, and the show makes sure it is visible. His father chose his own standards over his son. Vought chose Homelander over him. Payback chose freedom over loyalty. Crimson Countess chose relief over love. And now, Butcher, the one person Ben had actually spoken honestly to, even briefly, even incompletely, chose a child over their arrangement. Every trust Ben has ever extended has ended the same way. The Villain's Wiki notes that Ben became deeply embittered upon returning to the present, feeling abandoned, and that bitterness has specific roots in this repeating experience of being the person who gets left. He does not conclude from this pattern that something in how he relates to people needs to change. He concludes that people are not trustworthy, and that reliance on others is a structural error. The lesson he takes is the wrong one, and it is the only lesson available to someone who cannot look at their own role in creating the conditions they keep finding themselves in. What the Butcher relationship ultimately reveals about Ben is something the Revenge Tour and the Homelander confrontation do not show as clearly. There is a person underneath the Soldier Boy performance, a specific, recognizable human being with a real history and a real wound, and briefly, a real capacity to share something honest about himself when the conditions were right. That person exists. The show puts him on screen for those few scenes in the woods and makes him visible. He is not charming or warm or particularly likable in those moments, but he is real in a way that the performance around him never quite is. The tragedy is not that the person underneath is irredeemable. The tragedy is that the person underneath only surfaces in the specific and narrow circumstance of being around someone who is not asking him to perform. And those circumstances have been extraordinarily rare across a century of his life. His father demanded performance. Vought demanded performance. Payback required performance to maintain his authority. The celebrity world was built on performance. Crimson Countess was a relationship conducted through the performance. Butcher, for a window of days, was not asking for the performance. And in that window, Ben told the truth about his father to another human being, probably for the first time in his life. Then Huey expressed concern for someone else, and Ben punched him, and the window closed, and the performance came back. And by the end of the season, Ben was back in a pod. The moment passed without changing anything. That is the most honest thing the show says about what happens when someone with Ben's level of damage gets a brief exposure to the conditions that might have helped them earlier. It is not enough. A few days of not having to perform does not undo a century of having to. The opening exists and closes. The damage remains. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. All of that damage, the father, the corporation, the betrayal, the captivity, the son he could not reach, the brief, honest conversation in the woods, lives inside Ben's body in a way that the show makes literal and specific. The radiation his body produces, the blasts that detonate when his emotions spike, the way his physiology was permanently altered by 40 years of Soviet experimentation. These are not just science fiction details. They are the show's most precise visual metaphor for what unprocessed psychological damage actually does when it has nowhere to go. Understanding exactly how that works and what it means for the people around him requires looking closely at what the show has built into Ben's body as a direct translation of everything his mind cannot hold. Section 8. The body keeps the score. How Ben's trauma became a physical weapon. There is a Geiger counter scene in Season 3 that the show does not make a big deal out of. Huey is holding the device near Ben while Ben talks. Ben is venting about his past, his father, his history, the things that were done to him and taken from him. He is not crying. He is not raising his voice. He is speaking in the flat, controlled tone he uses for everything. The tone that is supposed to communicate that none of this touches him anymore, that he processed it and moved past it, and it is simply information now. The Geiger counter tells a different story. The radiation levels climb while he talks, measurably, visibly. The needle moves in direct response to what Ben is feeling, even though what Ben is feeling is something he would never acknowledge feeling. That scene is one of the most precise things the show does across its entire run. Most stories about trauma show it through behavior, through what people do when they are hurting, through their choices and their relationships and the patterns they fall into. The Boys does all of that, with Ben across every section of his arc. But the Geiger counter scene does something additional and more specific. It shows the trauma as a physical fact, not a metaphor, not a behavioral tendency, not a pattern that requires interpretation to see. A number on a device going up while a man talks about his father. The body reporting what the words refuse to. The show's explanation for how this works is established clearly across Season 3. When the Russian scientists had been in their facility from 1984 onward, they subjected him to extreme levels of radiation as part of their experimentation. For a normal human being, that level of radiation exposure would have meant death within days. For Ben, it meant something different. His compound V-enhanced physiology absorbed the radiation instead of being destroyed by it. Over 4 decades of repeated exposure, his body adapted to the point where it no longer simply survived the radiation. It began producing its own. The experimentation turned him into what the show describes as a living nuclear reactor. His body now generates radiation continuously, at all times, as a baseline function of existing. He cannot turn this off. He cannot choose to stop producing it. The radiation is always there, always emanating from him. Always measurable to anyone with the right equipment standing close enough. The critical detail is what controls the intensity, his emotional state. When Ben is calm, or performing calm, which is the closest he gets to it, the radiation output is at a manageable level. It is still present, still detectable, but not immediately dangerous to the people around him. When he becomes emotionally distressed, the output climbs. When his trauma is triggered, specifically when he hears the Russian song Pobyeg, or anything that pulls him back to the facility, the output can escalate to a level that becomes catastrophic. At its peak, when Ben is fully triggered and his emotional state is completely out of his control, the energy release can destroy entire city blocks. The show demonstrates this across multiple incidents with precise consistency. The first major incident happens within hours of his escape from Russia. He is walking through Manhattan, disoriented, processing the sensory overload of a modern city he does not recognize. He hears Pabeg playing on a nearby radio. The flashbacks hit immediately and completely. He is back in the facility. He is on the table. He is hearing that song while things are being done to his body that he cannot stop. The present moment disappears and the memory takes over. His radiation output spikes. The blast that follows kills 19 civilians and destroys a significant portion of a 5-story apartment building. 19 people die because his nervous system heard a song. The show does not present this as a villain attack. It is presented as a consequence, a straight line from what was done to Ben in that Russian facility to what happened on a Manhattan street nearly 4 decades later. He did not choose to hurt those people. He did not make a decision. His body responded to his trauma the way his body always responds to his trauma now, which is the only way it knows how, with a force that the people around him have no protection against. The second major incident happens at Herogasm. The TNT twins, who are hosting the event, tell Ben that Black Noir was the one who led the betrayal against him. Somewhere during this encounter, Pabeg plays again inside the building. The trigger activates. The blast goes off. The building is destroyed. Multiple guests die. The TNT twins are vaporized. Ben does not control this either. The sequence of cause and effect is identical to the Manhattan incident. Trigger, flashback, loss of control, explosion, death, aftermath. The third incident, the attempted self-destruction, is different in nature but connected to the same mechanism. When the boys move to subdue Ben and return him to containment, his response is to begin overcharging his radiation output deliberately. The villain's wiki is specific about what this means. Ben was attempting to kill himself. His terror of being put back in a pod, of being sedated and contained and experimented on again, was so overwhelming that he began building toward a detonation that should have been lethal even for him. His body began visibly overheating. He started emitting smoke. The radiation levels escalated to a point that the show indicates would have been catastrophic for everyone in the building. Queen Maeve stops this by grabbing him and jumping through a window, taking the blast in the open air. She survives, but loses an eye and her powers permanently. What the show is doing across these 3 incidents is building a very specific picture of what happens when trauma has no outlet except a physical one. Ben cannot cry. He cannot grieve. He cannot sit in a therapist's office and talk through what 40 years of captivity did to him. Partly because therapists did not exist in a form he would recognize when he was young, and partly because acknowledging that he needs that kind of help is the one thing his psychology was built to prevent. The emotional contents that would, in a person with access to healthy processing, move through grief and anger and fear, and eventually towards something like integration. In Ben, those contents have nowhere to go except outward. Literally outward. As radiation, as explosions, as the physical destruction of whatever is in the immediate vicinity when the internal pressure exceeds what can be held. The Geiger counter scene makes this metaphor concrete in a way that is almost too honest. His body is doing the emotional reporting that his words will not do. The device in Huey's hand is measuring something real about Ben's internal state in that moment. Something Ben himself is not acknowledging. Something he would deny if Huey named it. Something he would respond to with contempt or violence if pressed. But the number does not lie. The radiation does not perform. It simply reflects what is actually happening inside him, stripped of all the management and performance and controlled exterior that Ben has spent a century constructing. The marijuana that Butcher supplies during their time together is the show's clearest illustration of what managing this looks like in practice, and what the limits of management are. Heavy doses of marijuana suppress Ben's trigger response to a workable degree. When he is medicated, he does not detonate when reminded of Russia. The flashbacks are dulled. The immediate physical response is slowed enough that he can function in situations that would otherwise produce a catastrophic result. This is the practical solution the boys arrive at. Not treatment, not processing, not any form of addressing the underlying damage, but chemical management of the symptom. Keep the trigger from firing, and the weapon stays pointed in the right direction. The costs are immediate and significant. The same marijuana that dulls the trigger response amplifies Ben's existing paranoia to a degree that produces its own dangerous outcomes. The incident with the priest and the nun in the woods is the clearest example. Ben, medicated, becomes convinced that two stranded travelers are Mindstorm's mind-controlled agents. His reasoning is not sound. There is no concrete evidence, only the paranoid suspicion of a man whose nervous system has been altered by decades of captivity and is now additionally affected by heavy marijuana use. He shoots both of them. As the show reveals, his suspicion happened to be correct, which is coincidence rather than judgment. The marijuana gave him a wrong reasoning process that arrived at a right conclusion by accident. This is what management looks like for someone at Ben's level of damage. The options are not good and bad. They are bad and also bad. Do not medicate and risk the radiation blasts that killed 19 people on a Manhattan street. Medicate and risk the paranoid shootings of innocent-seeming bystanders who may or may not be mind-controlled. There is no option available to Ben, or to the people around him, that leads somewhere genuinely safer. Because the source of the problem, 40 years of forced experimentation on a person with no existing emotional processing tools, is not something that can be addressed with marijuana or any other management strategy. The show also uses Ben's radiation to make a point about how his emotional state and his destructive capacity are inseparable in a way that goes beyond individual incidents. His body emitting radiation at all times means that simply being near Ben carries risk. The people around him are always, to some degree, in his blast radius. Not because he chooses to threaten them, because the damage that was done to him is permanently externalized in his body, in a form that does not care about his intentions or theirs. That is an unusually honest picture of what severe unprocessed trauma does to the people in proximity to someone carrying it. Ben's version is literal and measurable with a Geiger counter. The real-world version is not measured with a device, but it is just as present. People carrying severe unprocessed damage do not keep it contained to themselves. It radiates. It affects the emotional environment of everyone around them. It makes the space near them feel unsafe in ways that the people affected cannot always name or explain. Ben's radiation is the show making that invisible social reality into a visible physical one. The body that came out of Russia in 2022 is not the body that went in during 1984. That much is obvious. The new power, the radiation, the altered physiology. What is less obvious but more important is that the mind that came out is also not the same mind that went in, except in the specific ways it remained completely unchanged. Ben's beliefs about masculinity, about strength, about what men are and are not allowed to feel, those did not update during captivity. They survived the experiments intact and came out the other side exactly as rigid as they were when they went in, now attached to a body that will literally explode when those beliefs about not feeling anything come into contact with feelings that are too large to suppress. The design of this, whether intentional on the writer's part or arrived at through the organic development of the character, is remarkably coherent as a piece of psychology. A man who was taught that emotions are weakness spent 40 years having emotions inflicted on him at an extreme level, with no outlet and no permission to process them. His body found its own outlet. It made the emotions into radiation. It made the suppression into pressure that builds until it can no longer be contained and then releases catastrophically. He does not get scared. He just detonates. That is what Ben told Huey in the woods. He does not get scared. He does not feel those things. And while he is saying this, Huey's Geiger counter is climbing, and 19 people in Manhattan are already dead, and a building at Herogasm is rubble, and somewhere in a Russian facility, there are 40 years of documentation about what it costs a human body to hold everything that a human mind refuses to acknowledge. The number on the Geiger counter is the most honest thing about Ben across his entire arc. More honest than anything he says, more honest than the performance of strength, more honest than the rejection of Homelander, or the brief conversation with Butcher, or the fury of the revenge tour. It is just a number, going up, while he talks about his father. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Everything about Ben's psychology, the father, the corporation, the betrayal, the captivity, the body that became a weapon, has been examined through his own experience of it. What has not yet been fully examined is what all of it looks like from the outside, through the eyes of the people whose lives Ben's existence damaged permanently. Because Ben's story does not happen in isolation. It happens to other people at the same time, and some of those people built their entire adult lives around the wreckage he left behind without ever knowing his name. Section 9. The wreckage he left behind. What Soldier Boy's existence cost the people around him. Ben never had to watch what he did to people. That is one of the structural advantages his power gave him across his entire life. He was always the most powerful person in any room he entered, which meant he always got to leave. The damage he caused stayed behind with the people he caused it to, while he moved forward to the next room, the next mission, the next performance, the next target. The gap between what Ben experienced of his own behavior and what the people around him experienced of it is enormous. And the show closes that gap deliberately across Season 3 by spending real time with the people who are still living inside the consequences of things Ben did decades ago and has long since stopped thinking about. Mother's Milk is where the show starts this accounting. Marvin T. Mother's Milk is introduced in Season 1 as someone with obsessive-compulsive disorder, specific rituals, a need for control, and a complicated relationship with the work of fighting soups. By Season 3, the show reveals the source of all of that. When Marvin was a child in Harlem, he watched Soldier Boy respond to a group of people stealing a car. He watched with admiration at first. This was Soldier Boy, the legend, the hero, the most celebrated man in America. Then Soldier Boy picked up the car and threw it. The car hit the building where Marvin and his grandfather were. His grandfather was killed. Marvin was a child. He watched his grandfather die because Soldier Boy threw a car without caring where it landed. What the show traces after that moment is the full cost of that single act of carelessness across 2 generations of one family. Marvin's father became consumed by the need for justice. He spent the rest of his life trying to bring accountability to Vought for what Soldier Boy did. Gathering evidence, building cases, writing letters, pursuing every legal and professional avenue available to a private citizen trying to fight a corporation with unlimited resources and government protection. He died at his typewriter, hunched over his work. The stress of the fight killed him before the fight produced any result. Marvin's father sacrificed his relationship with his son to pursue justice for his father. Which means Soldier Boy's carelessness did not just kill Marvin's grandfather. It also took Marvin's father, not through direct violence, but through the slow consumption of a man by an obsession he could not put down. An obsession that left less and less room for the son who needed him to be present. Marvin grew up with a father who was physically there and emotionally absent, the way Ben grew up with a father who was physically absent and emotionally withholding. The mechanism is different. The result is similar. Marvin's OCD, his rituals, his need for control in a world that keeps demonstrating it cannot be controlled. The show connects all of this directly to what Soldier Boy did in Harlem. The compulsive behavior is the nervous system's attempt to create predictability and safety in a person for whom the world became randomly dangerous at a young age. A child who watches a celebrated hero throw a car into a building and kill his grandfather learns something specific about safety that does not unlearn easily. The rituals are the adult version of that child trying to make sure he can see the car coming this time. Ben does not know any of this. He threw the car. He moved on. He has no awareness of Marvin's grandfather, Marvin's father, Marvin's OCD, or the particular shape of a family's grief across 2 generations. From Ben's perspective, that day in Harlem was a routine intervention. From Marvin's perspective, it was the event that restructured his entire life. The show makes Marvin's personal investment in the Soldier Boy mission the clearest it has been across any mission the boys have undertaken. He initially refuses to join. He tells Butcher he will not fall into the same trap his father did, will not let Soldier Boy become the obsession that costs him his family the way it cost his father. He has a daughter. He has an ex-wife he is trying to maintain a relationship with. He has built a life that his father's obsession never allowed his father to build. Joining the mission means risking all of that for the same enemy that already took everything from his family once. He joins anyway, because the pull of that accountability, the need to make Ben face what he did, is stronger than the resolve to protect himself from it. That pull is itself a piece of psychological inheritance. The same thing his father could not put down, the same inability to look away from an injustice that destroyed someone he loved, living now in the son who swore he would not repeat the pattern. Marvin is not the only person carrying Ben's wreckage forward into the present. Black Noir, whose real name is Irving, is the most physically permanent example of what Ben's damage does to the people closest to him. Irving joined Payback with ambitions. He was talented. He wanted to be an actor. The show confirms that he had the ability to be the Eddie Murphy of superhero cinema if the Beverly Hills Cop role had gone to him. A role that would have made him famous on his own terms, outside the mask, as a person with a name and a face, rather than a corporate symbol in a helmet. Ben took that from him. He used his personal connections with the film's producer to make sure the role went to someone else. Then he threatened Irving directly, making clear that any attempt to build an individual public profile, to step out of the supporting role Ben had assigned him, would be met with consequences. The threat was racially specific. Ben referenced the Jeffersons while making it, framing Irving's ambition as an attempt to move above his station in terms that left no room for misunderstanding about what he meant. Irving was already forced to hide his face behind a mask because Vought had decided a publicly black superhero was not marketable. Ben did not resist that arrangement. He used it. Then in Nicaragua, during the fight, Ben pinned Irving's face to the hood of a burning Jeep and bashed his skull in with his shield. The blows removed a portion of Irving's brain. They shattered his skull, scorched half his face, and produced neurological damage that never healed and never would. Irving lost the ability to speak. He lost the cognitive continuity that most people take for granted. He developed an internal world populated by cartoon animal friends, characters that exist only inside his own mind, and that the show depicts in animated sequences to represent what Irving's inner life looks like after the brain damage Ben caused. Every strange and distinctive thing about Black Noir across the entire show is Ben's handiwork. The silence, the cartoon animals, the fragmented way he processes the world, the physical scarring. All of it traces back to a few minutes in Nicaragua in 1984, when Ben was being subdued and took out the most devastating amount of damage he could on the person physically closest to him. Irving carried that for nearly 40 years. He continued working for Vought. He continued wearing the mask. He became one of the most feared members of the Seven, a figure of genuine menace and power, all while housing inside himself the wreckage of what Ben did to him in a field in Central America. The cartoon animals are not comic relief in the show's architecture. They are the coping system of a man whose mind was so severely damaged by Ben's violence that it required an entirely separate internal reality to function. Homelander kills Irving in Season 3 for not telling him that Soldier Boy was his father. The death of a man who spent 4 decades living with Ben's damage is caused, ultimately, by the secrecy required to survive in a world shaped by Ben's power. Even after Ben went to Russia, the consequences of what he was and what he did kept producing outcomes for the people who had been near him. Grace Mallory's connection to Ben is different in nature, but similarly lasting. Mallory was the CIA officer in charge of the ground operation in Nicaragua in 1984. She despised Ben from the moment she met him. He hit on her immediately and aggressively, could not read her contempt for his behavior, and responded to her authority with dismissal and condescension. Because she was a woman, and authority held by a woman was something his entire worldview refused to accommodate. She watched the Nicaragua operation turn into a disaster. She was knocked unconscious by friendly fire from gunpowder. When she woke up, most of her men were dead. She spent decades believing Soldier Boy had died there. She eventually became a key figure in organizing the Boys, the group dedicated to holding Supes accountable. The connection between her experience of Ben's world in Nicaragua and her later decision to build an infrastructure for fighting Supes is the show's way of showing that Ben's carelessness and violence did not just affect individuals. It shaped institutions and movements, and the professional choices of people who dedicated their lives to the problem he represented. The Payback members who survived Nicaragua and went on to their diminished post-Ben lives are carrying a different kind of wreckage. Crimson Countess ended up at a theme park performing for families, then lost that job, then was doing cam shows from a trailer at a sanctuary for chimps. Gunpowder became a gun rights spokesman at conventions. Mindstorm was hiding alone in the woods. These are not successful post-hero careers. These are people who were at the top of Vought's superhero ecosystem in the 1980s and ended up living in the margins of the world Ben's absence created. None of them thriving. All of them diminished in ways that connect directly to what it cost them to be near Ben for the years they were. The show does not make the Payback members entirely sympathetic. They did hand Ben to the Russians, and regardless of the context and the abuse that preceded that decision, the act itself has real consequences for real people. But it also does not let their post-Nicaragua lives look like freedom. Getting out from under Ben's authority did not produce the flowering of individual potential that Irving dreamed of and Crimson Countess might have hoped for. It produced people shaped by the experience of being near Ben, carrying the marks of what that proximity cost them, unable to fully separate who they became from what he did to them. The generational line that runs through Ryan is the show's most explicit statement about where Ben's damage goes next. Ryan is Homelander's son. Homelander is Ben's son. Ryan is, by the end of Season 3, watching Homelander laser a man's head off in public after the man throws a plastic bottle. He is watching this as a child. He is absorbing it as instruction. This is what men do with power. This is what strength looks like. This is the appropriate response to being disrespected in public. The lesson his grandfather delivered to Ben, the lesson Ben failed to deliver differently to Homelander, is now being delivered to Ryan through Homelander's behavior, with full visual emphasis on a public street. The line from Ben's father to Ben, to Homelander to Ryan, is not complicated or hidden. The show draws it clearly and without ambiguity. Each generation receives a damaged version of instruction about what men are supposed to be, delivers it to the next generation in a slightly different form, with a slightly different degree of violence. And the pattern continues, because at no point in the chain does anyone have the tools to recognize what is happening and choose differently. Ben's father did not have those tools. Ben, for all his power, did not have them either. Homelander, raised in a lab with no parents at all, has even less access to them than Ben did. Ryan, watching a man's head get lasered off, is receiving the most stripped-down and direct version of the instruction that the line has produced yet. What Soldier Boy's existence cost the people around him is not just measurable in individual incidents: the grandfather in Harlem, the brain damage in Nicaragua, the career that Irving never got to have. It is measurable in the shape of entire lives, in the psychological inheritances passed from father to son, in the institutions built to fight the problems he embodied, in the children watching things they should not be watching, and absorbing lessons that will take decades to understand and longer to undo. Ben moved through all of it without stopping. He threw the car and walked away. He bashed the skull and kept fighting. He built the patterns of dominance and control that his teammates eventually could not survive. And when they removed him from the equation, the damage he had already done continued producing consequences without him. The most unsettling thing about all of this is how ordinary the mechanism is beneath the superhero's surface. Remove the powers, remove the compound V, remove the radiation blasts and the Geiger counter and the Russian facility. What remains is the story of a man who was hurt in ways he never processed, who hurt the people around him as a result, who produced damage that spread through families and careers and generations, and who never fully understood the connection between what was done to him and what he kept doing to others. That story does not require superpowers. It happens everywhere. The show puts it in a cape and makes it loud enough that it cannot be ignored. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Understanding the full weight of what Ben's psychology produced requires one final piece of the picture, the piece that the show's creators were most deliberate about building, and that Jensen Ackles and Eric Kripke have spoken about most directly in the interviews that shaped how Season 3 was written and performed. The question of what Ben was actually designed to represent in the larger argument the show is making about America, about masculinity, about the century that produced him and the century that is still living with what that century built. Section 10. What Ben was built to say. Soldier Boy as America's mirror. Eric Kripke did not create Soldier Boy to be a villain. He created him to be a question. The question is not whether Ben is good or bad, redeemable or irredeemable, sympathetic or monstrous. Those are the easy framings, and the show resists all of them. The question Kripke built into the character from the beginning, and stated directly in his Variety interview about Season 3, is what happens when a specific set of ideas about what men are supposed to be gets passed from one generation to the next, across decades, without anyone stopping to examine what those ideas are actually doing to the people who receive them. Ben is the answer to that question, rendered in flesh and compound V and radiation blasts. He is what that process produces when it runs long enough and hard enough and without any interruption. Jensen Ackles understood this before he played a single scene. In his SFX magazine interview, he described the character in terms that went well beyond the show's fictional universe. He talked about the Western cowboy myth, the John Wayne ideal, the Marlboro Man image, the specific American construction of masculinity that told generations of men that strength means not feeling, that real men do not need help, that vulnerability is weakness, and weakness is failure. He called it directly bullshit. He said it raised generation after generation of damaged men who could not live up to something that never existed in the first place. And then he said something more personal, that he himself was probably one of the last generations to grow up inside that mythology, without anyone around him naming it as a problem. That personal dimension matters. Ackles was not playing a historical artifact from a safe distance. He was playing something he had direct experience of, something he recognized from his own upbringing, something his father had been taught by his grandfather, who served in the Second World War. The chain of transmission that the show depicts through Ben and Homelander and Ryan, Ackles saw it in his own family. He used that recognition to play Ben not as a caricature of a bad man from another era, but as a specific and recognizable product of a specific and real set of instructions. Ben was born in 1919. He came of age in the 1930s and 1940s. The world he grew up in had very clear and very rigid ideas about what men were. Men did not express fear. Men did not show emotional pain. Men did not ask for help or admit weakness or acknowledge that something had hurt them. Men solved problems through action and force and forward motion. Men who deviated from this were not considered real men. The social consequences for deviation were severe enough that most men did not deviate. They absorbed the instructions and passed them on. This was not unique to Ben's family. It was the cultural air of the period, breathed in by everyone. What made Ben's version of it more damaging than the average was the specific cruelty of his father's application of those ideas, combined with the superhuman power that Compound V then gave him to enforce them on everyone around him. The ordinary man raised on 1940s ideas about masculinity hurts the people in his immediate circle. Ben, enhanced beyond any normal human capacity, hurt people across decades and across the country and eventually internationally. The show uses his costume and his public image to make this argument visible in the most direct way possible. Soldier Boy's uniform is an explicit parallel to Captain America. The Star-Spangled Shield, the patriotic color scheme, the positioning as America's greatest wartime hero. This is not accidental. The show is drawing a deliberate line between the idealized image of American heroism that Captain America represents in mainstream culture and what that image looks like when the mythology is stripped away and the reality underneath it is examined. What is underneath the patriotic costume, the show argues, is a man shaped by abuse and shame, and the specific damage of being told that feelings are weakness from the age he was old enough to understand language. The show does not say Captain America is secretly terrible. It is not making a claim about Marvel's fictional universe. It is making a claim about the cultural mythology that Captain America represents. The idea of the pure, selfless, emotionally uncomplicated American hero who fights for what is right and never wavers and never breaks. That mythology, the show argues through Ben, does not describe a real human being. It describes a performance. And the people who are handed that performance as an instruction manual for how to be a man are not being helped by it. They are being set up to fail in ways they may not even be able to name, because the mythology does not include a language for the failure it inevitably produces. Ben performed that mythology so completely and for so long that the performance became the only version of himself the world ever saw. The real version, the child stealing sips of his father's cocktails, the young man desperate for approval, the person who genuinely believed Crimson Countess loved him and held on to that belief through 40 years of torture. That version existed entirely behind the shield and the costume and the aggressive certainty. The world got Soldier Boy. Ben did not get to be Ben, because Ben was never a self that was allowed to develop independently of what Vought and his father and his culture needed him to perform. Kripke's specific language in his Variety interview was about the Greatest Generation myth. He said his writers had a character who could take an audience through every decade of the 20th century and show them what men were actually like in each one. Not the myth of the Greatest Generation, but the reality. The reality, Kripke said, was that those ideas about manhood were being passed down from fathers to sons in ways that kept producing damage. The show wanted to trace that transmission specifically and clearly. Ben is the trace. He is what 1919 to 2022 looks like when you follow a single man through it. A man who received the worst version of the era's ideas about strength and worth, who was then given superhuman power to enforce those ideas, who was used by institutions that profited from his performance of them, who was discarded when his usefulness ran out, who came back damaged in ways he refuses to name, and who passed the damage to the next generation in the exact same form he received it. The America that produced Ben is not gone. That is the show's most uncomfortable argument, and the one it makes most persistently through his character. Ben woke up in 2022 using 1940s language and 1940s ideas about what men are allowed to feel and do. And the show surrounds him with a contemporary world that has evolved in its language and its public positions on these things, while the underlying patterns remain very much active. The men around Ben, Butcher, Homelander, the institutional structures of Vought, are all operating on versions of the same instructions Ben received. The language has updated. The damage has not. Ackles made this point in his Good Morning America interview with particular clarity. He said Ben is from a time that is past, but that the toxicity he embodies still exists today. He is not a historical curiosity, a relic of a worse era that has been fully left behind. He is the most visible and extreme version of something that is still present and still producing consequences, just without the same cultural permission to be quite as loud about it. The show's decision to make Ben physically unable to contain his emotional damage, to make his trauma literally explosive, literally measurable on a device, literally deadly to the people in his vicinity, is the most direct statement the writers make about what unexamined emotional suppression costs. Not just the person carrying it, the people around them. The radiation Ben produces does not ask anyone's permission. It does not check whether the people it is going to hurt deserve what is coming. It just radiates. Because the thing producing it cannot be contained anymore, and there was never a system in place to process it safely before it reached this point. That is the show's argument made physical. The man who is told from childhood that feelings are weakness spent a century suppressing his feelings, and the suppression eventually produced something that kills 19 strangers on a Manhattan street because a song played on a radio. The cover story Vought gave Ben's disappearance is worth examining one more time through this lens. They said he heroically sacrificed himself to stop a nuclear meltdown in Ohio. A man who was actually being handed to a foreign government to be tortured was simultaneously being celebrated for fictional self-sacrifice. The gap between the official story and the reality is the gap the show is always pointing at. The gap between what America tells itself about its heroes and what those heroes actually are when the costume comes off and the PR stops working. That gap is not just about soups. It is about the cultural stories that get told about what strength looks like, who has it, what it costs, and who pays that cost. Ben's cover story says he gave everything for his country. The reality says his country gave him to Russia, and then told everyone he died a hero. The people who benefited from his performance got to keep benefiting from it even after he was gone. The people who bore the cost of his existence. Marvin's family, Irving's brain, Gunpowder's childhood, did not receive a cover story that made their suffering meaningful. They just absorbed it and kept going. Ben's relationship with the American government across his life is one of the show's most precise pieces of political observation. He is used when useful, discarded when not, and celebrated in ways that serve the people celebrating him rather than the person being celebrated. The Reagan administration ordered the Nicaragua cover-up not to protect Ben, but to protect the government from accountability for a covert operation that had gone sideways. Ben's heroic death story served their interests. The fact that Ben was alive and suffering in a Russian facility while his heroic death was being mourned nationally was not their concern. This is what institutions do with the people they use as symbols. The symbol serves the institution. The person inside the symbol is secondary. Ben's entire life, from Vought manufacturing his biography to the government manufacturing his death, is a portrait of a man who was turned into a symbol so completely that his actual humanity became irrelevant to everyone around him, except insofar as it could be managed and directed and contained. The show is careful to never let Ben off the hook for what he does. He abused his teammates. He damaged Irving permanently. He killed Gunpowder's childhood. He threw a car in Harlem. He called his son a disappointment. None of that is reframed as acceptable because he had a difficult father or spent 40 years in a Russian facility. The consequences are real, and the people who bore them are real, and the show does not minimize either. But the show does something more complicated than simply condemning him. It insists on holding the full picture at the same time. This is what he did. This is also what was done to him. This is what the institutions that shaped him extracted from him, and what they cost him. This is how the ideas he was handed became the damage he produced. All of it, simultaneously, without resolving into a clean verdict that lets the audience stop thinking. Jensen Ackles put it simply in the Tumblr-captured interview excerpt that circulated widely after Season 3 aired. He said that when he looks at Soldier Boy, he sees something he recognizes. In celebrities, in politicians, in neighbors. He said toxic masculinity is something all of us can identify in the world around us, and that playing Ben required sitting inside the specific reality of what that ideology does to a person from the inside, not just what it looks like from the outside. Ben is not a monster from another time. He is a mirror held up to a set of ideas that are still in circulation, still being passed from fathers to sons, still producing damage that shows up in the behavior of men who do not have the language to connect what they are doing to where it came from. The show puts that mirror in a patriotic costume and gives it superhuman strength, and makes the radiation visible on a Geiger counter, so that none of it can be looked away from. What Ben was built to say is not that men are broken, or that masculinity is inherently destructive, or that the past was uniformly terrible. What he was built to say is simpler and more uncomfortable than any of those broad statements. He was built to say that specific ideas, handed down without examination, produce specific damage. That the damage does not stay with the person who receives it, that it moves, that it finds the next person in the line, and that the line does not end until someone in it decides to look at what they are holding and put it down. Ben never put it down. The show makes sure of that. Every season he appears in, he is still carrying the same thing his father gave him in a wealthy house in South Philadelphia in the early 1920s. 100 years later, give or take, it is still in his hands, still producing consequences, still moving toward the next person in the line. All of that, the history, the psychology, the physical damage, the generational transmission, the cultural argument, eventually has to be brought together into a single, coherent picture. Because the individual pieces are significant, but what the show is ultimately asking is whether they add up to something. Whether Ben, taken as a whole, across everything the show reveals about him, is a tragedy, or a warning, or both. The conclusion to that question is where the full weight of his psychology finally lands. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.